The buzzards told Jed Callahan a story he didn't want to read. He'd seen that pattern before, the lazy spirals in the bleached white sky. It was a language written in shadow and wings, and it always ended the same way. Death. He wiped the sweat from his brow, the rough back of his glove scraping against his skin. The desert sun was a hammer, and the land was the anvil. Down on one knee, digging for the stubborn roots of wild arnica, he felt the heat bake right through his shirt. Then the wind shifted. It wasn't just the smell of dust and sun-cracked earth. It wasn't just the rot of some coyote-claimed rabbit. It was something else. Something metallic and wrong. Copper. Blood. A switch flipped inside Jed's chest, cold and sharp. His head snapped up, eyes scanning the brittle grass, the long scar of the dry creek bed. The desert was supposed to be quiet. But this was a different kind of quiet. A held breath kind of quiet. Then he heard it. It was so faint he almost missed it. A sound caught between a whimper and a sigh. It wasn't an animal. It was human. It was the sound of someone who had given up on being found. He was moving before he even thought about it. His boots crunched over bone-dry twigs as he pushed through the thorny mesquite. One hand instinctively went to the worn handle of the knife on his belt. The other batted away branches that clawed at his face. He followed the sound, that ghost of a cry, until he broke through into a small clearing and his blood ran cold. There, half hidden under the shade of a twisted pinyon pine, was a woman. She was small, her frame delicate, but her skin had the deep copper glow of the desert tribes. A dark, ugly stain spread across the side of her buckskin dress, drying black in the heat. It was blood. So much blood. Her hair was a tangled mess of pine needles and red dust. Around her neck hung a simple amulet carved from bone. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Jed stood frozen. The air punched out of his lungs. He knew what this was. A native woman, alone and wounded this deep into settler land. This wasn't just trouble. This was a lit match hovering over a barrel of gunpowder. He glanced over his shoulder back toward the hills where his own small cabin sat. He could almost see his daughter Rose and his son Jude, their laughter echoing in the dirt. His whole world was in that cabin. Safe. Quiet. He looked back down at the woman. Her breathing was shallow, a tiny flutter in her chest. She was dying. And damn it all, she didn't look any different than his own wife had the night the fever finally took her. Just a person, hanging on by a thread. Hell, Jed muttered to the empty air. He knelt beside her, his joints protesting. He uncapped his canteen and gently lifted her head, bringing the cool metal to her cracked lips. A trickle of water spilled down her chin. Her body gave a small shudder, a tiny spark of life fighting back. Her eyes fluttered, but they didn't open. Still alive. Still a chance. He knew what he had to do. He knew it was crazy. He knew it could burn everything he loved to the ground. But he also knew he couldn't just walk away. He couldn't leave her for the buzzards. With a grunt, he slid his arms under her, lifting her carefully. She weighed almost nothing, like a bird with a broken wing. Her blood soaked into his shirt, warm and sticky. The smell of pain and fear filled his nostrils, but he didn't flinch. He carried her toward home. The cabin came into view as the sun began to bleed across the horizon, stretching the shadows long and thin. It wasn't much, just a small box of wood and nails, but it was his. Rose was on the porch. She was only 8, but she had her mother's eyes, old eyes, watchful eyes. She saw the bundle in Jed's arms, and her small face went pale. "Papa?" Her voice was a small, frightened whisper. "Who is that?" Jed didn't answer. He pushed the door open with his shoulder and stepped into the familiar warmth of the cabin. He laid the woman down on the cot by the fireplace, the one they kept for sickness and injuries. Jude, only 5, peeked out from behind a curtain, his thumb stuck firmly in his mouth. Rose followed her father inside, her eyes wide. "Is she a prisoner, Papa?" Jed stood over the cot, his chest tight. He looked at his daughter, her face a mixture of fear and curiosity. He looked at the dying woman on the cot. Then he looked back at Rose. "No," he said, his voice rough. "She ain't the enemy, Rose. She's a life, and you don't leave a life to rot in the desert." That night, a heavy silence fell over the little cabin. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the woman's ragged breathing. In her fevered sleep, she mumbled a single word. Nahila. Jed didn't know if it was her name or a prayer. He cleaned the gash in her side with the last of his whiskey and packed it with a poultice of herbs, the way his wife had taught him. The wound was deep. It wasn't from an animal. It looked like it had been made by a knife. He changed the dressings 3 times before midnight. Rose helped, bringing him clean rags and a bowl of water without being asked. She watched the woman's still face, her expression unreadable. Jude had fallen asleep on the floor, a picture book open on his chest. Jed sat in the old rocking chair, the shotgun resting across his lap. He stared into the flames, his mind racing. Every instinct screamed at him that he had brought a firestorm into his home. But when he looked at the woman, all he saw was the ghost of his wife. He had made a promise to himself after she died. He wouldn't let another person suffer alone if he could help it. He just never imagined that promise would look like this. Just before dawn, she stirred. Jed was instantly on his feet, his heart pounding. The woman's eyes snapped open. They were dark, wild, and filled with pure animal terror. She tried to sit up, but a sharp gasp of pain sent her falling back onto the cot. Jed held up his hands, moving slowly. "Easy," he said, his voice low and calm. "You're safe here." She didn't understand his words, but she understood his tone. Her eyes darted around the room, taking in the sleeping children, the hearth, the rough wooden walls. Then her gaze landed on the knife still sheathed on Jed's belt. Her body went rigid. Jed followed her eyes. He saw the fear. Without a word, he unbuckled the belt, walked outside into the cold morning air, and laid the knife on a flat rock by the fence, in plain sight. Then he came back inside, empty-handed. He didn't know if she understood the gesture, but as he sat back down, he saw something in her eyes change. The terror was still there, but it was joined by something else, a flicker of confusion, a hint of something that wasn't fear. She watched him for a long time, her breathing shallow. Then her eyes fluttered closed and she fell back into an exhausted sleep. Jed let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He stood on the porch as the sun came up, rubbing the exhaustion from his face. He felt footsteps behind him and turned to see his neighbor, Esme Santiago. Esme was a tough woman who had buried 2 husbands and outlasted 3 droughts. She had a face like a road map of hard times. "You always did have a habit of taking in strays, Jed," she said, her voice dry as dust. She nodded toward the open cabin door. "You sure that one won't bite the hand that feeds it?" "She had a chance to," Jed said, looking out at the mountains. "My knife was on my belt all night. She never made a move." Esme crossed her arms, her dark eyes sharp. "So were your children." Jed didn't have an answer for that. Esme didn't push it. She just looked past him, her gaze sweeping the hills that surrounded the valley. "They're watching, you know," she said quietly. "All of them. The folks in town, they'll start whispering. And her people. They'll be looking for her." She turned to leave, then paused. "You be careful, Jed. You're a good man. But good men are the first to get buried in this country." She walked away, leaving Jed alone with the rising sun and the weight of his decision. That night, as he sat watch, he heard it. The faint rhythmic sound of hoofbeats in the distance. They were slow, measured, and there were many of them. They were coming. The mornings grew colder. a sharp bite in the air that promised a harsh winter. Jed found himself checking the horizon more than the woodpile. He knew they would come. It was just a matter of when. Inside, the woman, Nahila, slowly healed. She still hadn't spoken another word, but her eyes followed his every move. They were intelligent eyes, wary, but not hateful. She watched him with an unnerving stillness, as if she were weighing his soul. One morning, Rose sat by the cot, a piece of charcoal in her hand. She drew a crude flower in the dirt floor. "Is she going to die, Papa?" she whispered. "Not if I can help it," Jed answered, his voice low. Rose studied the bone amulet around Nahila's neck. It was smooth and white, carved with strange symbols. Her small fingers reached out to touch it. "Don't," Jed said, his voice sharper than he intended. Rose flinched. "It might be important to her," he added, softer this time. Just then, Nahila's eyes opened. They weren't clouded with fever anymore. They were clear. She looked at Rose, then at the half-drawn flower in the dirt. Her gaze softened for just a moment. Rose, emboldened, pointed to herself. "Rose," she said clearly. Then she pointed to her sleeping brother by the fire. "Jude." She looked back at the woman and pointed. "You?" The cabin was silent. Nahila just stared. Rose tried again. "Name?" Nahila blinked slowly. A moment passed. Then, so quiet it was barely more than breath, a single word escaped her lips. "Nah." Rose's face broke into a triumphant grin. "Nah," she repeated. She scrambled to her feet and ran to her father. "Papa, she spoke. Her name is Nah." Jed walked back into the cabin, his heart thumping. He looked at the woman on the cot. "Nah," he said, testing the name. She didn't respond. Her eyes had drifted to the fire, a distant, haunted look returning to her face. It was like a door had opened for a second, only to be slammed shut again. That evening, a strange thing happened. Jude, who was usually shy and timid, crawled over to the cot and fell asleep with his head resting on Nah's leg. Jed started to move him, but stopped. Nah didn't push the boy away. She didn't even seem to notice. She just stared into the flames, her hand resting inches from Jude's head, a silent, unknowing guardian. Later, after the children were asleep, Jed sat across from her. "I don't know what trouble you're in," he said quietly, "but you're safe in this house." No reply. Just the flicker of the firelight in her dark eyes. As he got up to add another log to the fire, her voice, raspy from disuse, stopped him cold. "Awa!" He turned. She was pointing a trembling finger at the tin cup of water on the small table beside her. Water. He brought it to her, his hand brushing hers as he helped her drink. Her skin was cool. When she was done, she lay back down and closed her eyes, shutting him out once again. Jed stood there for a long time, the empty cup in his hand. She barely spoke, but he felt like he was having a conversation that spanned years. 2 nights later, the hoofbeats returned. Jed was outside, sharpening his axe under a sky littered with stars. The sound started as a whisper, a vibration in the soles of his boots. Then it grew louder, slow, deliberate. Many horses. He stood up, grabbing the shotgun he always kept leaning against the cabin wall. In the pale moonlight, they appeared at the edge of the clearing, a line of riders, maybe 20 of them. They were ghosts on horseback, their faces painted in stark patterns of black and white. Some carried rifles, others held bows. They made no sound, just sat on their horses, watching his cabin, waiting. At the head of the group, a man dismounted. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with long gray braids and a face that looked like it had been carved from rock. Scars crisscrossed his bare chest. He walked forward, his presence radiating an authority that needed no words. Inside the cabin, Jed heard a sharp intake of breath. Nah was sitting bolt upright on the cot, and for the first time since he'd found her, she looked truly utterly terrified. The tall man stopped at the edge of the porch light and spoke a single word into the night. It was a name, but it sounded like a judgment. Nahila. Na stood up from the cot, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. She was unsteady, her face pale, but her eyes were locked on the silhouette in the doorway. Jed raised the shotgun. "Stay behind me," he whispered. "No," she said. It was the first full sentence he'd ever heard her speak. Her voice was tight, strained. "Don't!" The man outside called her name again, louder this time, a clear command. Jed stepped onto the porch, positioning himself between the cabin and the riders. Rose was awake now, rubbing her eyes. "Papa?" "Stay inside," he ordered, his voice low and firm. But Na was already moving past him. She pushed open the screen door and stepped out into the moonlight, her hands held open at her sides. She was unarmed, vulnerable. Jed moved to stand beside her, the shotgun feeling heavy and useless in his hands. He could feel the eyes of all 20 riders on him. He saw the glint of rifle barrels. He was horribly, hopelessly outmatched. The tall, scarred leader stepped forward. He didn't even look at Jed. His eyes were fixed on Na. Then another man, younger and leaner with fire in his eyes, dismounted and walked to stand beside his leader. He glared at Jed with pure hatred. Na did something that shocked Jed to his core. She dropped to her knees in the dirt and bowed her head. The leader spoke in a language Jed didn't understand. The words were sharp, guttural. Na replied in a whisper, her face still turned to the ground. The younger man spat in the dirt near Jed's feet. He let out a string of angry words, pointing a finger first at Na, then at the cabin where the children were hiding. Na spoke again, her voice a little stronger this time. Jed only caught one word he understood. Children. The leader, who Jed would later learn was named Takakota, looked past Na, his gaze piercing the darkness of the cabin. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Takakota barked a single command. The younger man shot one last venomous look at Jed before turning and mounting his horse. One by one, the riders wheeled their horses around and began to melt back into the night. All except Takakota. He stood there, his eyes finally settling on Jed. The look he gave him could have stripped flesh from bone. He spoke, his English slow and rough, as if the words physically pained him. "She is not yours to keep, white man," he said, his voice a low growl. He paused, his gaze shifting back to the kneeling woman. "But perhaps she is no longer ours to take." And then he was gone, vanishing into the darkness like a phantom. Jed stood on the porch, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked down at Na, who was still kneeling in the dust. She didn't move. She didn't make a sound. She just knelt there, a solitary, broken figure under the cold moon. He had saved her from the desert. But he was starting to realize he had no idea what he had saved her for. By morning, she was gone. Jed's heart dropped into his stomach when he saw the empty cot. He grabbed his rifle and ran outside, his mind racing with terrible possibilities. Did they come back for her? Did she run away? He found her by the creek bed, in the exact spot where he had first seen her. She was kneeling by the shallow water, washing her hands over and over again, as if trying to scrub away a stain that wasn't there. He approached slowly and crouched beside her. "You know him," he said. It wasn't a question. She nodded, her eyes fixed on the water. "My father." A bitter, ironic laugh escaped Jed's lips. Her own father. He waited. "The other one," she said after a long silence. "My cousin Nico. He does not like me." "He made that pretty clear," Jed muttered. Silence settled between them again, broken only by the sound of the running water. "Are you going back with them?" Jed finally asked, dreading the answer. Na turned to look at him. Her eyes were clear and steady. "No." Jed blinked, surprised. "They'll be back for you." "I know." "Then why stay here?" he asked, genuinely confused. You know the trouble it could bring me. My children. She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the charm she'd pulled from a pouch on her belt. It was made of woven grass and small, colorful beads. This land, she said quietly, it does not hate me. And your daughter? She smiled at me. She held out the charm. For her. Jed took it, his fingers brushing against hers. Thank you. Just then, Rose appeared at the top of the creek bank holding Jude's hand. She saw the charm in Jed's hand. For me? She asked, her voice bright. Jed smiled. For you. Na held out her hand to Rose, and the little girl took it without a moment's hesitation. Later that day, as Jed was repairing the fence post Nico had kicked over, a single rider approached. It was Takakota. He was alone. He dismounted and walked toward them. Na met him in the middle of the yard. Father and daughter stood facing each other, a world of silence between them. Jed stayed by the fence, watching. You wish to stay? Takakota asked, his English still rough. Na nodded once. I do not understand, he said, his voice laced with confusion and pain. They are not your people. They saved me, she answered simply. Takakota turned his hard gaze on Jed. We do not save what we cannot keep. Sometimes you save something just because it needs saving, Jed replied, his voice even. That's the whole point. A long, tense silence hung in the air. Then Takakota reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small leather pouch. He handed it to Na. Seeds, he said. From your mother's garden. If you stay on this land, then grow something. Do not let her memory turn to dust. Na clutched the pouch to her chest, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She whispered something to him in their own language. Takakota simply nodded, turned, and mounted his horse. Before he rode off, he looked back at Jed one last time. Keep your fences low, he said, but keep your fire high. There are things in these hills far worse than my family. The warning hung in the air long after he was gone. That night, Esme rode up, a jar of honey in her hand. To sweeten the days ahead, she said, though her eyes were grim. You're going to need it. What is it? Jed asked. Word travels fast, she said. Reverend Mallory is coming out from town. He heard you were harboring a heathen. Jed's jaw tightened. He looked through the window of the cabin. Rose was asleep, her head resting on Na's shoulder, clutching the little woven charm in her hand. Are you ready for that fight, Jed? Esme asked softly. Jed watched the two of them, a fierce, protective feeling rising in his chest. I wasn't ready for any of this, he said. But I'm not sending her away. Esme gave him a small, sad smile. Then I hope God is walking with you, because the Reverend sure as hell won't be. The preacher arrived like a storm front, all thunder and judgment. He didn't knock. The cabin door flew open with a bang, and Reverend Malachi Mallory strode in as if he owned the place. He was a tall, gaunt man in a long black coat, with eyes that burned with righteous fire. In one hand he clutched a heavy, leather-bound Bible. Jed was at the table peeling potatoes. Na was sitting with Rose and Jude, patiently sounding out words from a child's primer. The quiet, domestic scene shattered. Mallory's eyes landed on Na, and his face twisted into a sneer of disgust. He looked at her like she was an infestation, a disease to be purged. I heard there was a sickness in this house, Callahan, he boomed, his voice filling the small cabin. I've come to offer God's cure. We didn't ask for a doctor, Reverend, Jed said, placing his knife down on the table very slowly. Mallory's gaze swept the room, lingering on the peaceful lesson, the warmth of the fire. It seems the sickness has already taken root. He turned his burning eyes back to Jed. What do you want, Mallory? The preacher slammed the Bible down on the table. The sound made Jude jump. She requires redemption, and you, Callahan, require deliverance from your sin. Jed stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "She's not yours to save." "She is the Lord's to save," Mallory shot back. "And I am his instrument." He pulled a folded, official-looking document from his coat. "By order of the Territorial Authority, any undocumented native found on settler land is to be remanded to the custody of the church for re-education." His smile was chilling. "You are breaking the law, Callahan, harboring a fugitive from God himself." "She's a human being," Jed said, his voice a low growl. "She is a savage. Her people are violent, pagan heathens who worship demons in the desert." Jed took a step forward. "The only demon I see right now is the one standing in my house, screaming at my children." The cabin fell silent. Then Na spoke. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the tension like a knife. "What do you think I am?" Mallory turned to her, his face a mask of contempt. "You are a lost soul, something that God, in his infinite mercy, can still forgive." "I have never sinned against you," she said, her voice steady, "or your God. Your very existence is a sin against the civilizing grace of the Lord," he thundered. "That's a lie!" Everyone turned. Rose was standing on her chair, her small fists clenched. "That's a lie," she repeated, her voice trembling with a child's pure indignation. Mallory's eyes narrowed into slits. "You see, the poison spreads. You are teaching your own children to embrace the devil's work." "I'm teaching them to see people," Jed snarled, moving to stand in front of his family. "You want to call that a sin? Go ahead. But you are not taking her." The Reverend stared at him for a long, hard moment. "This is not over," he hissed. "I will return, and I will bring the law with me." "You do that," Jed said, his voice dangerously calm. "Just make sure the law knows who it's working for." After the preacher left, a heavy gloom settled over the cabin. That night, Na sat by the window, not eating, just staring out into the darkness. "He hates what he can't understand," she said softly. Jed sat down beside her. "He's not the only one. He believes he is protecting something sacred," she murmured. Jed looked at her profile in the firelight, the strong line of her jaw, the wisdom in her eyes. "No," he said. "He's afraid of something sacred, and that's a whole different thing." The next few days were quiet, but it was the quiet of a coiled snake. Jed knew Mallory would make good on his threat. Esme brought news that the preacher had been seen riding toward the nearest fort. "He's not just bringing the law, Jed," she warned. "He's bringing an army." The morning it happened, Jude came screaming from the chicken coop. "Papa, the barn! The barn is on fire!" Jed's blood turned to ice. He ran outside and saw it. Flames, orange and black, were clawing at the sky, devouring the old wooden structure he had built with his own 2 hands. A thick column of black smoke billowed into the air, a funeral pyre for his livelihood. It wasn't an accident. The latch on the door had been broken, and the smell of kerosene hung heavy in the air. This was a message. Na was beside him in an instant, throwing a soaked blanket onto the spreading flames. Rose and Jude formed a desperate bucket brigade from the well, but it was no use. The fire was too hot, too fast. Jed kicked open the stall doors, his lungs burning, and managed to get the horses out. But the goats trapped in their pen were lost. By the time the fire finally burned itself out, the barn was nothing more than a smoking, blackened skeleton. They stood there, covered in soot and sweat, staring at the ruin. Na touched his arm. Her hand was steady. This was his answer. Jed looked at the destruction, at the fear on his children's faces, and something inside him hardened into steel. "Then here's mine," he said. He turned, walked to the tool shed, and came back with a hammer and a fresh box of nails. He was going to rebuild. Bigger, stronger. He would not be driven out. That night, Na brought him a poultice for the burns on his hands. As she gently wrapped them, she pressed the small bone amulet she wore into his palm. You gave me shelter, she said, her voice soft. This is for protection. He closed his burned hand around it. Are you afraid? He asked. Yes, she admitted, but not of him. Then what? Her gaze drifted to where Rose and Jude slept, huddled together by the fire. Of belonging to something I could lose. Jed swallowed hard. He understood that fear better than anyone. It was easier to have nothing than to have something that could be ripped away from you. As the last embers of the barn fire glowed in the darkness, a different kind of fire was being lit on a distant ridge. It was a signal fire. Takakota had seen the smoke from the valley, and he was already riding back, not to take his daughter home, but to help her defend the one she had found. The smell of smoke clung to everything for days, a constant reminder of the attack. But Jed worked relentlessly, his grief and anger fueling every swing of the hammer. Na worked beside him, her silence a comforting presence. She taught Rose how to weave yucca fibers into strong cord to bind the new posts. She sang old songs in her native tongue, melodies that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Esme came by with supplies and a grim look. The town is buzzing, she said. They're calling you a traitor. They say you've taken up with a heathen witch. Let them talk, Jed grunted, hoisting a heavy beam into place. It's more than talk, Jed, she warned. They're afraid of what you're building here. It goes against everything they believe. That night, Na found him washing the soot from his back at the creek. A long red burn mark snaked across his shoulder, where a flaming beam had grazed him. She touched the edge of the wound, and he winced. She began to hum, a low, quiet sound as she gently cleaned the burn. I have seen worse scars, she said. A small, grim smile touched Jed's lips. Good, because I have a feeling I'll be collecting a few more before this is over. She met his gaze, a flicker of humor in her dark eyes. If this is your hell, you seem determined to make it a home. Jed stopped, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he truly smiled. If you keep saying things like that, I'm going to start believing you actually belong here. I do, she said, without a trace of hesitation. He wanted to say, so do I, but the words caught in his throat. 3 days later, Takakota and a handful of his warriors rode into the yard. They didn't come with weapons drawn, but with solemn faces. Takakota dismounted and approached Jed, holding out a leather pouch. I did not come for my daughter, he said, Na translating his words. I came to see the home she has chosen to defend. I stay, Na said firmly to her father. Takakota studied Jed's face, the new lines of exhaustion and determination etched there. You protect her? With everything I have, Jed answered without hesitation. Then you will need to plant deeper roots, Takakota said, handing the pouch of seeds to Na. Grow something that will outlive the fire. He turned to leave, but paused. You have drawn a line in the sand, but you cannot stand on it alone. The warning proved true. A few days later, Jed found a dead rabbit on his porch, its throat slit, its blood used to paint a crude cross on the steps. Rose's scream echoed across the valley. Jed buried the animal, his face a mask of cold fury. That night, Na strung a line of protective beads across the doorway. The fear was a constant presence, but so was something else. Hope. A week later, Jed watched as Na taught Rose and Jude how to braid corn husks into little dolls. He heard his children laugh, a sound he realized he hadn't heard since before the fire. That evening, he found Na by the creek, planting her father's seeds in a small hidden patch of fertile soil. She was whispering to the earth as she worked. I was thinking, Jed said, coming to stand beside her. We should call this place Agua Clara Ara, for the clear water in the creek. He looked at her. For what's worth protecting? She looked up at him and smiled. Agua Clara Ara, she repeated, the name sounding like a prayer on her lips. That night, a fragile peace settled over the small homestead, but it was shattered at dawn. Esme came riding in hard, her horse lathered in sweat, her face pale with terror. "They're coming, Jed!" she gasped, sliding from the saddle. "Soldiers! A whole patrol! And Mallory is with them!" Jed stood still, the news landing like a physical blow. Na came out onto the porch, her face calm, as if she had been expecting this all along. "You have to run!" Esme pleaded, turning to Na. "Get out of here before they arrive." Na didn't move. She just looked at Jed. Rose came out barefoot, clutching her cornhusk doll. "I don't want her to go," she whispered, her lip trembling. Jed looked at his daughter's terrified face. He looked at Na, standing tall and defiant. He looked at the half-rebuilt barn, a testament to his own stubbornness. He had rebuilt before. He would not let them burn his life down again. He stepped off the porch and faced the road. Let them come. Far in the distance, a cloud of dust was rising against the morning sun. Mallory was coming to finish what he started. But this time, he wasn't just facing one man. He was facing a family. The riders appeared at dusk, a dark line of uniforms and steel against the blood-red sunset. 10 soldiers, led by a grim-faced captain, with Reverend Mallory riding beside him like a vulture. Jed stood in the yard, his sleeves rolled up, waiting. He wasn't holding a rifle. He was holding a shovel. He had been turning the soil in the new garden plot. He looked like a farmer, not a fighter. But his eyes were as hard as granite. Na stood on the porch, a silent sentinel with Rose and Jude clutching at her dress. "Jedediah Callahan!" Mallory's voice boomed across the yard, dripping with triumph. "Your defiance ends today!" The captain unrolled a scroll. "By the authority of the United States Army and the Territorial Church, I am here to take custody of the Apache woman known as Nahila." "Her name is Na," Jed said, his voice calm and even, "and she is not going anywhere." "You are obstructing federal law!" Mallory shrieked. "This is treason!" "Is it?" Jed said, taking a slow step forward. "Or is it just a man protecting his family? You came here with papers and guns, but you don't understand what you're up against." He looked past the soldiers, past the preacher, and into the heart of the valley. "You can burn my barn. You can threaten my children. But if you think I will hand over a member of my family just because your piece of paper says she doesn't belong, then you have no idea what kind of man I am." The captain shifted uncomfortably. His men glanced at each other. This wasn't the simple arrest they had been promised. The cabin door creaked open, and Na stepped out into the dying light. Her chin was high, her gaze unwavering. "I will go if I choose to go," she said, her voice clear and strong, carrying across the yard. "Not because you point guns at children." Mallory scoffed. "You have no choice, heathen. You belong to no one." Na's eyes met Jed's for a fleeting moment. Then she looked back at the preacher. "I belong to this land," she said, "and I belong to the people who stood between me and death when I was left to die." "Enough of this!" Mallory screamed. He raised his hand to give the order. "Take her!" 2 soldiers started to step forward, their rifles raised. Jed moved to block their path. "This isn't going to go the way you think," he warned. And that's when it happened. A sound, sharp and clear, echoed from the hills surrounding the valley. A single piercing note from a horn. The soldiers froze. Their heads snapped up. On the ridge overlooking the homestead, dark silhouettes had appeared against the sky. Takakota, and behind him 24 of his warriors sitting silently on their horses, bows drawn, watching. They didn't charge. They didn't scream. They just watched. A silent, deadly promise. Mallory's face went white. "It's an ambush. They're savages." "No," Jed said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "They're family, and they just came to see if I'd keep my word." The captain looked from the silent warriors on the ridge to the determined man in front of him, and then to the woman and children on the porch. He lowered his rifle. "We weren't ordered to start a war," he said, his voice tight. We were ordered to remove one woman. Then you have a problem, Jed said, because if you take her, you're going to have to take us all. And I don't think the story of soldiers dragging a man and his two small children away from their home is going to sound much like justice when it gets back to the fort. A young soldier at the back of the line lowered his rifle, then dropped it in the dust. I'm not a part of this, he said. Another followed his lead. Mallory stared, his face contorted in a mask of pure rage and disbelief. His authority had crumbled to dust. "This isn't over!" he shrieked, wheeling his horse around. He galloped away, a coward fleeing a battle he had already lost. The remaining soldiers, shamefaced and silent, followed him, leaving Jed and his family standing alone in the quiet twilight. Later that night, Jed found Na by the creek, staring at her own reflection in the dark water. "You did it," she whispered. He knelt beside her. "No," he said, taking her hand. It was the first time they had touched, not out of necessity or comfort, but out of something more. "We did." Back at the cabin, Rose was drawing a picture with a piece of charcoal. It was a crude drawing of a tall man, a woman with long braids and two small children, all standing in front of a little house with a big, welcoming fire. "This is us," she said, holding it up for Jed to see. He kissed the top of her head. In the hearth, the fire burned warm and bright. Outside, in the small garden, the first of Takakota's seeds had begun to sprout. Word of what happened at Agua Clara Ara spread through the territory like a slow-moving river. The story changed with each telling, but the core of it remained the same. A line had been drawn, a stand had been made, and a family that didn't match had refused to break. The soldiers never came back. Reverend Mallory, disgraced and defeated, left the territory soon after. His sermons of hate found no more fertile ground. But something else began to happen. One day, a man named Luther Cobb rode up to the homestead. He was leading a tired horse carrying his wife and young son. His face was worn, his eyes haunted. "We heard a story," he said to Jed, his hat in his hands, "about a place where a man is judged not by the blood in his veins or the God he prays to, but by the work of his hands." Jed looked at Na, who stood beside him on the porch. He looked at the faces of the weary family. He thought of the dead rabbit on his steps, the ashes of his barn, the fear in his daughter's eyes. Then he thought of the laughter, the shared meals, the quiet strength he had found. He stepped aside and gestured toward the open cabin door. "Welcome to Agua Clara Ara." They were the first, but they were not the last. More families came. A Mexican family fleeing the bandits in the south, an Apache family whose land had been stolen by the railroad, a former soldier, his soul scarred by war, looking for a place to be quiet. They were a collection of the broken, the lost, and the outcast. They built a community. They expanded the garden, raised a new, larger barn together. They built a small schoolhouse where Rose taught the other children their letters, and Na taught them the names of the stars in her own language. Takakota and his people became regular visitors, not as warriors, but as neighbors, sharing knowledge of the land, trading goods, and telling stories around a common fire. Years passed. The children grew. The saplings Jed planted grew into tall, strong trees. Agua Clara Ara became more than just a homestead. It became a promise, a testament to the idea that a home is not built with wood and nails, but with courage and acceptance. One evening, Jed and Na sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. Gray now streaked Jed's hair, and his hands were gnarled and calloused from years of hard work. "I used to think this land was filled with nothing but ghosts," he said quietly. Na leaned her head on his shoulder. "The ghosts are still here," she said. "We just learned how to live with them." When Jed finally passed, years later, he was buried under the big cottonwood tree overlooking the creek. The entire community, a patchwork of faces and cultures gathered to honor the man who had simply refused to let a life rot in the desert. In his coat pocket, Rose found a worn, folded piece of paper. It was a letter, addressed to the people of Agua Clara. "I came here with nothing but scars," it read. "I leave with a family. If this place is still standing after I am gone, it is because we learned that strength is not about building higher fences, but about opening wider doors. Do not let the world convince you that your differences are your weaknesses. They are your wealth. Let that be our story." And it was. The story of Agua Clara was carried on the wind, a quiet legend of a place where the lost could be found and where a family was defined not by blood, but by choice. If you believe that one small act of courage can change the world, and that everyone deserves a place to call home, then don't forget to subscribe for more stories that matter.